All right, we're here this morning and we're going to talk a little bit about issue one. Although this is such a complex issue, it may be more than a little bit. But I have with me today J. Carro, who is a retired professor of law emeritus from the University of Akron Law School. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing fine. So let's start out with let's go back to the very beginning and discuss the situation with abortion. Roe versus Wade. It's overturned. That sends the whole case back to the states, and that's where we stand right now. And Ohioans have to decide how they want to um, handle the idea of abortion in
That's correct.
Ohio.
And Pam, as you know, it's a very emotional issue. For certain segments of our community, it's a religious issue, it's an emotional issue. And so there's a lot of debate on both sides. And I appreciate your effort to kind of have an objective view of this issue one.
Yeah, and so when we hear all of the things that are happening with issue one, the pro side, the con side, the yes vote, the no vote, what can people, there's a lot out there, and I think a lot of misinformation out there. Where does it all start? You explain to us.
There is a lot of misinformation out there. I would say there are several legal resources you would want to look at. Roe versus Wade, the 1973 U.S. Supreme Court case, Dobbs, the 2022 Supreme Court decision, the Ohio statute, the so-called fetal heartbeat statute, and the proposed amendment. When you look at Roe versus Wade, we're talking almost a 50-year decision. And what that case said was that there is a right of privacy, either under the 14th or Ninth Amendment, and that right of privacy protected the right to an abortion. And so what that case decided was not only do you have a right to have an abortion as a pregnant woman, but we're going to create a system looking at trimesters. So you have the first 3 months, the second 3 months, the third 3 months, and the interests of the state vary as the fetus approaches viability. And viability is mentioned in this referendum, which is really a question of when the fetus can survive outside the womb. And right now, if you have a premature birth, the child goes into, the neo unit. But that's not the same thing as providing for sustenance that would be provided by the mother while the baby's in the womb. So you look at Roe versus Wade, constitutional right to abortion, trimester system. That gets overturned in Dobbs. What Dobbs says is it's a state issue. It's up to the people in the state. It's up to the state legislature to decide. So it rejects the idea that there's a constitutional right to have an abortion. And it leaves it at that, and it leaves it to the states. So now you come to Ohio. Ohio statute is so-called fetal heartbeat. The fetal heartbeat is detectable somewhere between 5 and 6 weeks after conception. So if you were pregnant at 5 weeks, you might not even know it as a female. And so has caused a lot of disturbance in the state. Hence, we come to our referendum. And our referendum appears to recreate Roe versus Wade and the viability test.
And as people look at it, they are concerned about the viability. But they're also talking about how it describes an individual and the age of that individual. There's a lot of people talking about young people possibly being able to get an abortion without their parent being involved. How is that mentioned in here?
It's really not directly mentioned. It talks about an individual's voluntary exercise of the right, a person. Okay, so that could include a juvenile, a pregnant person, a pregnant woman under 18. My view on that would be that unless this referendum expressly connects itself to that issue, the law in Ohio is going to stay the same. The law in Ohio is that if you're under 18, you need parental or guardian consent. So in my view, this is not going to change any of that.
Okay, and is there, once this would say this passes, is there still places for challenges in the court?
Absolutely. So this is going to amend Article 1 of the Ohio Constitution. Separate that from the U.S. Constitution. It has nothing to do with the U.S. Constitution. and the state can give greater rights than the U.S. Supreme Court gives. What can also happen is the General Assembly can reject this by a three-fifths vote of each house, the Ohio House, the Ohio Senate. So even though the people voted in, if you get three-fifths of each house, that could be overturned. Now there could be legal challenges, as you suggest. People saying, "Well, now you've eliminated parental consent requirements," and the language is not directly attributable to that question, but I could see people litigating that.
Is there anything else in this issue one that you think could bring on litigation after the fact?
Well, I think certain people will deal with the issue of fetal viability. So fetal viability is a function of the ability of the fetus to exist outside the womb. There's an interesting scientific issue on this, and this is going to sound a little weird, but scientists have developed an artificial womb in which they have raised sheep, to the ability to survive outside that artificial womb. Now, certainly there's been no experimentation with human fetuses, but the point I'm making is that there may soon be a so-called artificial womb that a child could be taken from the mother and put into this and grow into a child. I mean, isn't that strange?
Yeah, that's very strange. So, as I hear people also talking about the fact that they think that it's too broad, so they are pushing people to reject this issue and wait for the next time, so to speak. I mean, that seems to be an argument on the opposition side. Wait to the next time to narrow it down.
Right, and I understand that argument, but if you look at the language, it talks about viability, fetal viability, which is a reference back to Roe versus Wade. So that argument, in my view, doesn't carry a lot of weight. The question of viability is a question of, in a medical doctor's judgment, is the fetus capable of surviving outside the womb? If so, that fetus is viable, and there can be no abortion.
And we've seen this happen in other states. I think Ohio's like the
Yes,
ninth state,
something like that.
something like that. And in all the other states, it has been approved. It has. So, I mean, have you heard any rumblings of what Ohio looks like?
Well, there have been some attacks in those other states on the very issue you're discussing. Because there's no mention of parental consent for a minor, they've litigated that issue, and that hasn't gone anywhere. This referendum, really, in my view, focuses purely on viability. It seeks to replace the fetal heartbeat. The fetal heartbeat can be determined about 5 to 6 weeks after conception, and again, you may not know that you're pregnant. So that this is an effort to reject that.
Okay, and that's where you think that's where the whole thing revolves around as
Correct.
far as this goes. Um, Again, I'll ask you what are your thoughts on the possibility of it passing in Ohio?
The percentages appear that the polling percentages appear that it's going to pass, and that's going to create some litigation. Inevitably, we are a very litigious society.
Yeah.
People will litigate whether something is yellow or blue, and so I don't doubt that there'll be some litigation, and eventually it'll have to go to the Ohio Supreme Court.
And the Supreme Court,
The Ohio Supreme Court?
right?
Who knows?
Yeah,
Who
because the
knows?
makeup of the Ohio Supreme Court.
It's an interesting body. I've argued before the Ohio Supreme Court about 17 times. Not this particular manifestation of it, but it's always a difficult thing to predict what the Supreme Court's going to do, because you have 7 different viewpoints with 7 different backgrounds. So it would be hard to tell, but that's where it'll ultimately go. And then if it gets there and there's an opinion out of that court, then of course it could go to the U.S. Supreme Court. If it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, the current makeup of that court would say Dobbs would control, and whatever the state decides, the court would abide by.
And there's a certain faction of people who, are really looking into this and researching and, trying to determine. They know how they feel, they know how they're going to vote. But there's also other faction of people who are going to walk into the polling place, or they're going to vote, absentee or however they choose to vote, and they're going to look at that issue on the ballot. If you look at how it's presented, it's confusing. It's a very confusing thing as you start to read it. The language is important, right?
The language is very important, and that's why I would suggest if you're really concerned about issue one, take some time to be an informed voter. Read Roe versus Wade. Read Dobbs. Look at the Ohio statute, the fetal heartbeat statute, and then look at the referendum. But don't just walk in and say, "Geez, how do I feel today? Yay or nay?"
Yeah, and I'll be discussing issue two at a different time, but it's the same thing with that one too, right?
Issue two is getting a lot of pushback from police and prosecutors as well. They just came out opposing it because there's no way to really test whether a person is under the influence of marijuana unless you do a blood test, which implicates the Fourth Amendment.
There you go.
It's a tough thing.
See, that's a whole nother discussion,
Yes, it
correct?
is.
All right. Well, we appreciate you coming
Sure.
and explaining all this to us. And JD and Carro, of course, is exactly right when he says that you need to really sit down, take a look, and do your research on it. Thank you for coming by.
Thank you for doing this.